presentation will be about how Europeans created race. From the lens of a critical race theorist, race is seen as a socially constructed means of distributing rights and power. Race only has one function, and that is racism. Throughout my presentation, I will be discussing the creation of race and its implications today. I will discuss several laws and cases for the purposes of understanding the sentiments behind their outcomes as well as their roles in the creation of race. White slavery and the concept of beauty. Contrary to popular belief, slavery is not something that began with Africans. Slavery and slave trading had actually been a part of European experience long before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. The term Caucasian was coined in the late 18th century by German scientist Johann Blumenbach. Blumenbach's career was centered around studying the anatomy of what he called the human races. Using the Common Index of Color and other body measurements, Blumenbach classified the human race into 5 varieties. He endowed the Caucasian variety with an unimpeachable scientific pedigree. Historically, 2 types of slavery were most prevalent: fruit labor, which was mainly performed by Africans and Tartars, and sex slavery, which was prevalent throughout Europe. Female slaves with a more European appearance were considered more attractive. These women were referred to as odalisques. Most often pictured young and naked, they were considered feminine because of their sexual availability. The illusion of freedom, covertly affirming white supremacy through the American legal system. Implemented by Britain, the Transportation Act of 1718 allowed for the removal of convicts to North American colonies due to overpopulation in Britain. Crackers, scum, and dregs, people who Americans would commonly refer to as the lower class, were sent over to America. It is extremely important to note that the term cracker was used before the United States of America. Historically, crackers were poor white manual laborers who drove livestock with a whip, hence the term cracker. Although it was enacted almost 100 years after the inception of slavery in America, the Transportation Act set the tone for slavery in the United States. The poorest, dirtiest European people were sent here as indentured servants. Their subjugation led to our oppression. As I discuss the next few points, I ask that you remember the characteristics of European slaves and convicts. State v. Mann was a case in which the Supreme Court justified the cruel and unreasonable battery on a slave with economic, safety, and the benefit of the slaves themselves. Judge Ruffin proclaimed that the power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. Souther v. Commonwealth was a case in which the excess torture of a slave led to his death. The Session Acts of 1847 through 1848 provided that murder committed by willful and excessive whipping or cruel treatment was first-degree murder, which was to be punished with death. The court held that in order to constitute murder in the first degree, there must be an intention to kill. Souther received only a 5-year sentence. The Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution. I had to combine these 3 legislations because in the Declaration of Causes and Necessity, the committee went into great detail citing its understanding of the principles of humanity and the government's duty to protect mankind. Yet, thousands of African American men fought alongside Europeans in exchange for what they thought would be their freedom. But after independence was declared and the Constitution was enacted, they were everything but free. There are no explicit mentions of slavery in the Constitution, but slavery is all over it, and that is evident through cases like State v. Mann and Souther, in which the judges are able to interpret the laws in such a way that they essentially legitimize racial powerlessness. This speaks to the deception of white supremacy, which must operate covertly in order to effectively serve its purpose. Classification, segregation, and regulation. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 effectively embedded white supremacy into law through the following devices. It established new property rights for slave owners, allowed for the legal, free trade of slaves with protections granted by the courts. It was the first time Virginia defined the term mulatto. It established courts of trial, prohibited blacks, regardless of free status, from owning arms. Blacks could not strike a white for any reason. Whites could not be employed by blacks, and it allowed for the apprehension of suspected runaways. In the case of People v. Hall, a free white citizen was convicted based on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. Like African Americans, natives, and mulattoes, the Supreme Court held that Asians did not qualify as free white citizens and therefore could not testify against a white person in court. The charges were reversed. Invalidating the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, the Supreme Court in Scott v. Sanford held that blacks, whether free or slave, were not citizens and therefore could not sue in a court of law. Color, not free status, is what determines citizenship. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, a man of 7/8 European descent and 1/8 African descent was classified as black and forced to sit in the colored railway car. Plessy was a landmark decision that confirmed this separate but equal doctrine, upholding the constitutionality of state laws that required segregation in public facilities. Before 1705, slaves and servants were legally considered equal. This series of legislations furthered the perpetuation of racial oppression by drawing a clear, defining set of rules for African Americans in the United States. Because no one except a white person could testify against a white person, People v. Hall furthered the notion of whites being God-sent and untouchable. Plessy v. Ferguson proved that the notion behind many of these laws were to keep the Caucasian bloodline pure and untamed. No matter how much or how little African blood one had, if you were black and white, you were black. If you were white and native and black, you were black. Since African Americans were considered a subhuman species, European Americans did everything in their power to keep the two races separate. Crushing the hopes of many, Scott v. Sanford proved that the Constitution was not written with African Americans in mind, despite the empty promises. Slaves could continue to fight for their freedom, but they would never be free. Though the oppression of African Americans accounts for an enormous portion of American history, every other ethnic group that European Americans have come in contact with have been subjugated in some way in true white supremacist fashion. This is yet another example of how laws are created and interpreted in the interest of whites only. Because slavery has been legally abolished for about 150 years, which seems like a long time, many people today have been confused into thinking we live in a post-racial society. Please don't be mistaken. Race and racism is very much alive, and the evidence is all around us. Turn rain on the thunder, tell the storm I know. I'm a walk, I'm a march on the regular. Ain't no white flags blue. Forgive me, I've been running when I'm blind and true. I'm a rain on the cellular, tell the sweet I'm new. I'm telling these tears going fall away, fall away. Oh, be the last one burning Tuesday.